Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with us this week we've got Freddy Gray, Deputy Editor of Spectator. Welcome. How are you doing?
Delighted to be here, Fraser, yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on. And as usual, Tom Slater, of course, Editor of Spiked. Coming up on today's show, the FBI raid on Donald Trump, the downfall of Alex Jones, and the crazy scale of campus censorship. So, former President Donald Trump's Florida mansion was raided this week by the FBI. I mean, this is extraordinary and unprecedented, you could say, Freddie. Could you give us some of the details about what's happened?
It's an amazingly weird story. I can't quite come to terms with it, actually. Because, well, the way it broke was Donald Trump releasing a statement on Monday night saying, the FBI have raided my home, they've cracked my safe.
Yeah. And
essentially, you know, the story, which is true, that the FBI did do it, it definitely happened, is the most amazing validation of everything that Trump says. This is not to say that what Trump says is necessarily true, but the FBI seem to be doing exactly what he's always said happens, which is the deep state, the big institutions of America will do anything to stop him running again. The reason they did the search, the putative reason for the search, was that they were looking for some presidential records that Trump had apparently withheld or possibly hid. We have no idea whether they found anything. It all adds up to this sense that they are just desperate to find something. And what I found very odd was sort of just looking at the reactions to it. There was a Bloomberg piece very quickly saying, this is an Al Capone moment.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter if what we get him on is just a stupid technical thing. We're going to get him.
Yeah.
And that is the way people who hate Trump in America think. They think he's so vile that we've got to do anything to stop him. It doesn't matter how shady or dodgy it is what we're doing. So if that's the case, I think it may be even weirder than that. It may be possible that the FBI actually do know something and that they're going after something on the tax records. There's a lot of tax record stuff going on this week. Yeah. Separate case, but the FBI may be involved. It's just the Get Trump thing. And the Get Trump thing has been going on for 6 years and it's exhausting, but it always ends up helping him. And it gives him this amazing launch pad, this
for
perfect opportunity for his 2024 campaign, which is what he's been looking for. And it in a way, it sort of exonerates him of January 6th. I know that's a crazy thing to say because I think he behaved very badly after the election. I thought it was, you know, even if you think the election was stolen, I think you have to accept the result. But now he can say, well, yes, of course, these guys are, I am taking on the deep state. Yeah. And he released a video within hours, very polished video, saying, you know, the country is falling apart. I'm going to make it better.
And Tom, I mean, obviously no one is above the law or anything like that, but there's always going to be this suspicion when, you know, someone like Trump, who we know is so hated, is targeted in this way.
No, and, you know, I was amazed at the lack of skepticism or at least kind of concern on the part of the liberal intelligentsia, kind of liberal media. I mean, I wasn't amazed, really. I mean, they have learned to
They've got form.
They have got form. They've learned to love the security services.
Yeah.
They've, you know, former spooks have become household names and regulars on MSNBC and CNN and all the rest of it over this time. And what I was really struck by is because this obviously has the potential to represent, if it is even just some form of overreach, a real significant intervention in the political process. And yet you've got card-carrying liberals who are amazingly relaxed about it. And the argument is essentially they wouldn't do this if they didn't have the goods.
Yeah.
So you just have to kind of take their word for it, as you know, we're expected to take their word for it on Russiagate or any of these other incredible interventions of the FBI and the American state in democratic politics, effectively. And I think Freddie's exactly right. Whatever the kind of details of this particular case, it's undeniable that there has been like a protracted campaign to just get Trump by any means necessary. I mean, the New York Times was reporting in April that Biden himself was telling confidants that Trump is a threat to democracy and he has to be put in jail, essentially. So to deny that there is, if nothing else, this pressure exists, I think is absolutely ridiculous. And as Freddie says, it's only going to have the complete opposite impact as everything that the kind of liberal establishment and corporate media of the US do. It always backfires on them, as I'm sure it will in this case as well.
They always seem to be overreaching. I mean, yeah, Freddie, what do you make of this argument? You know, it's the FBI, we can trust them. It's Merrick Garland, he's really, you know, straight-laced and above board. They would never dream of doing something political in this way.
Well, it's madness, obviously. And then a lot of people are saying, you know, well, if if it's anti-Trump, if it's sort of prejudice, then why is it carried out by the FBI, who's headed by a Trump appointee? So, but Christopher Wray is notoriously, a kind of Bush era person who I actually spoke to a Trump guy who was in London yesterday, and he said, Trump hates him and they hate each other. So I don't think that stands up. Although, I mean, if it were to be an FBI conspiracy to help Trump, it couldn't have been much better. That's the weirdest thing about it. And then I think also what the sort of real upshot of it is that American democracy is decaying very, very rapidly before our eyes.
Yeah.
And this looks like a banana republic type situation. And what's worse than that is also the way the Republicans respond. So the Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, says, we're coming after Merrick Garland.
Yeah.
Once we get in November, clear your calendar, Merrick Garland. And all the Republicans are like, yeah, we're coming for them. Yeah. Blah, blah. And it's like so juvenile.
Yeah.
But also,
that's dangerous.
Democracy then becomes like, we get in power, we use the Justice Department to attack you, or we attack the Justice Department if we think it's corrupt. And so power is basically just handed over and then becomes a sort of sledgehammer to arrest or imprison or prosecute the other side.
Yeah, I mean, so we're sort of losing the kind of peaceful balance of power. We're losing, the last 2 elections at least, the losers' consent in America, with both sides denying that the other side won. I mean, this is very dangerous.
But I think, as you say, it speaks to the hypocrisy as well, because, of course, Trumpists really don't have the moral high ground when it comes to not trying to, at least in the kind of theatrical sense, pursue your enemies via kind of legalistic means. The last time all of these discussions were going on about whether or not mishandling classified documents might bar you from public office was in relation to Hillary Clinton. There was a lot of discussion about that ahead of her race in 2016 because of her emails. But what you see time and again is effectively you have one side, the Trumpist side, kind of being quite almost like performatively anti-democratic, a bit authoritarian. And then the Democrats kind of showing them how it's done. Yeah. Like that's the kind of sense that we get here. They're just much better at it. And similarly, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about January 6th, of course, and the sense in which Trump has not only tried to scupper democracy, but he's also done so by, peddling these batshit conspiracy theories, all of which is largely true. But at the same time, as you say, Hillary Clinton has never really properly conceded the 2016 election. She does think that if it wasn't for those pesky Russians, she would have won it. And so both sides of American politics in many respects are kind of mired in conspiratorial thinking, are very willing to at least attempt to use the justice system as a means to kind of exact their political ends. It's just one side are much more effective at it. Yeah. It might still backfire, but I think that's the sort of picture that we're seeing at the moment.
Well, there's also this sort of whataboutery thing. So if you say, well, I mean, Clinton never had her houses raided. Yeah. If you put that out on Twitter or something, people will go, that's just whataboutery. But whataboutery sometimes is right? Particularly in justice, because justice is supposed to be fair and equally applied. And I mean, it's just true that the Clintons never would have had their houses raided over such a very minor thing. Yeah,
or what we know, or what we think is a minor thing.
True. Yeah,
yeah. And Freddie, it'd be remiss of me to not ask: is he definitely going to run?
Well, so the Trump person I saw yesterday said, which is what a lot of other people have been quoted in the press saying, said if there was any doubt in his mind before Monday, it's made up now. And so it's become the sort of, this is the moment where he goes, I have to run. Yeah. And also because, he may have to run because if he doesn't run, he'll be in jail.
He's got to pardon himself.
So he'll have to, exactly. So I think, and that's another conspiracy theory that goes with it, which may have some truth to it, that some Democrats are keen to goad Trump into a run, right? Because they think that's with the midterms coming up, which they're widely expected to lose. That is their way of drumming up the blue vote to stop a red wave.
Because I suppose while Trump is still very popular with the Republicans, he's quite divisive in the country. I mean, he lost the last election.
Yeah. 50% of I think independent voters think that his behavior around January 6th was criminal. And that is a problem. Trumpists can deny it as much as they like. That is a problem for winning an election. But I still think if he were to run as a presidential candidate against Joe Biden, I think I would put my money on Trump, actually. Unless they rig it. It's a joke.
This is a perfect place, actually, to come on to Alex Jones.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking a bit about conspiracy theories of the Trumpist kind, the Clintonite kind. Really, the kind of ultimate conspiracy theorist of our age is Alex Jones. and he suffered a pretty humiliating defeat in court last week. He's been ordered to pay nearly $50 million to one of the families or the parents of one of the victims of the Sandy Hook massacre, which Jones infamously declared a false flag attack, a kind of, government attempt to G up support for gun control laws. I mean, Tom, what do you make of the way that Alex Jones is kind of held up as this, almost like this, the person who invented lying and disinformation in American politics?
No, he's become very significant, not least over the Trump era, when there was a very kind of active attempt, partly on his part, but also on the liberal media's part, to connect the two, to paint them as kind of part of the same movement, all the rest of it. And was also one of the kind of early victims of big tech censorship. So he got kicked off of all of the main platforms in 2017, I think. He was kind 18. One of kind of string of high profile people who increasingly got kicked off. It was funny, back in those days, they made a point of saying it wasn't about conspiracy theories, it was about hate speech. Although now conspiracy theories can definitely get you kicked off as well. And he's really become the kind of center of the sort of post-truth panic, if you will, which has been quite alarming as far as it's justified all kinds of quite Orwellian censorship, which is a bad idea anyway. I mean, I think censorship is far more dangerous than any conspiracy theory, and it also has a habit of fueling conspiracy theories, so it's not a good idea. But I think it's also allowed the kind of mainstream establishment off the hook, really, in terms of mainstreaming a kind of slightly jaundiced conspiratorial view of the world. One of the famous things that Jones will return to is kind of one of these classic conspiracy theory tropes, which is satanic paedophiles. They're not just Satanists, they're not just paedophiles, they're satanic paedophiles. Sometimes they're interdimensional.
Sometimes globalists, even more disgusting.
Even more horrendous slur. And, that was a pretty mainstream panic back in the 1980s in America as well as Britain. So there's this attempt to kind of just isolate him and treat him as if he's the only problem, as well as a means to kind of a rolling of the pitch, if you like, for more and more extensive censorship. It's not to defend what he did in this particular instance, calling Sandy Hook a false flag and stuff is very disgusting, etc. But it's quite clear that he's been set up as, not in this trial, but he's been held up, shall we say, as all that's wrong with the world. And I think that's is both wrong and quite dangerous in terms of the consequences of it.
I mean, Freddie, Tom alluded to this kind of connection between Alex Jones and, the Trump movement. And, Alex Jones was even at January 6th and things like that. I mean, what do you make of that connection? Does it speak to that kind of broader conspiratorial
Well, if in your
thinking?
darker moments you do think perhaps the world is run by satanic paedophiles, you would think that the last few weeks they've been on a bit of a roll, the satanic paedophiles, because the Trump FBI raid, the Alex Jones thing, Steve Bannon's prosecution, which is, I mean, extraordinary. I think every lawyer in America who's not insanely anti-Trump or anti-Steve Bannon thinks that this is trumped up and ridiculous. So you've got, Steve Bannon famously says it's not the deep state, it's the in-your-face state. Well, they are getting in the face of the Trump movement, or just the sort of wacky media world around Trump. And as Tom says, with Alex Jones, the Sandy Hook stuff was obviously insane, and I think it's right that the parents should be able to sue, and if they win the case, fair enough. What I find weird is like the sort of, it's not enough, we've got to completely destroy him. Perjury, let's put him in jail forever. Alex Jones is a comedian, effectively. He's not even a sort of, it's not real journalism, and also everybody assumes that, I mean, it's true that in the post-truth world that people do sort of ride between believing it and not believing it at the same time, and it's a bit dangerous that we don't believe in truth. But this applies to everything now, not just Alex Jones. And Alex Jones is almost better than a lot of media because it's so obviously absurd, and you can just go, oh, he's just going off on one. Whereas if you watch Morning Joe or MSNBC, you're supposed to take everything they say very seriously, even though often it's as ridiculous, I would say.
And has a
not quite as ridiculous.
And has a much kind of bigger impact, because policy is formed around that, because police investigations are launched in relation to that. If you think about, the UK and the VIP paedophile scandal, this complete nonsense fabricated by this fantasist and convicted paedophile, as it turned out, himself. This was peddled by the likes of James O'Brien, the respectable media. They leapt on it, they didn't challenge it whatsoever.
Tom Watson, the deputy Labour leader.
Exactly. No one was ever really held to account for that, as it turns out. But also, it had a real tangible consequence. People had their names dragged through the mud. They were subjected to all these trials. A lot of the men accused in that kind of died whilst awaiting their fate and all the rest of it. Someone who watches Alex Jones takes it a bit too seriously and maybe, shows up at a pizza restaurant or whatever. That does happen, and that is condemnable. But at the same time, in terms of its real impact on life and society, these mainstream kind of acceptable Martha's Vineyard version of conspiracy thinking are much more dangerous. Definitely.
I've got an Alex Jones story, if I may share it.
Please.
I sat next to him once at a dinner. Don't ask me why. And
the fan club.
and obviously I knew who he was, and I was talking to him, and he had a completely different voice. He was being quite normal. And then I said
French
something.
Or something.
He was like, so nice to meet you. And so we were just talking. Then I asked him a question that I think he suddenly thought, oh, God, I'm talking to a journalist.
Yeah.
And then he suddenly went, well, the elites are terrified because, and he changed character.
Yeah.
He just so it's an act, it's a shtick. And I'm sorry to have exposed him, but everybody knows this, right?
Yeah.
That it's a performance routine because he's like a clown.
You mean you don't believe that the chemicals in the water are turning the frogs gay, or
don't think
the
he
US
actually thinks
government is,
obviously, I think the frogs are
manipulating the weather.
So the reason there's a water shortage is because we all know that the frogs are turning gay.
Coincided with monkeypox. I'm just asking questions.
Have you seen the country music clip that somebody has turned Alex Jones's rants into a country music song? Brilliant. And it's one of the funniest things I've seen. I recommend you. People watching should look it up.
You got a favourite song, Alex Jones moment?
I think you've stolen the water's turning the frogs gay. You can't really get much better than that. Him talking about eating his neighbours.
That's a good one.
That was good as well.
You're watching the Spiked podcast. While you're here, you should subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell so you never miss a video. But even better, to keep up with all of Spike's content, all of our brilliant articles and essays that we publish every weekday, you should sign up to our newsletter, Today on Spiked. Every weekday, you'll get a roundup of all of Spike's content, plus some exclusive commentary. To sign up, just go to spiked-online.com/newsletters and click Today on Spiked. That's spiked-online.com/newsletters and Today on Spiked. Now, back to the Spiked podcast. So, returning to a familiar theme on the Spiked podcast, Times investigation has revealed, or restated, I should say, the shocking scale of censorship on British campuses. They found that several universities have been pulling books from courses, books that are possibly too challenging for students, not in a kind of mental way, but in a sort of emotionally challenging way. And they've slapped over 1,000 trigger warnings on classic texts, including Chaucer and Shakespeare. Tom, what have you made of this latest revelation?
It tells us what we already know, which is that universities have been going down this road for a very long time. And it was reading this, and you were kind of struck by, I just don't know if there's any way back for a lot of these universities, certainly a lot of the kind of humanities courses and the arts courses and whatever. They're so steeped in this stuff now. There was a lot of people who were trying to kind of naysay this particular investigation, people focusing on the fact that I think they found it's like 10 universities had either dropped or made books optional because that they were in some ways upsetting, and people saying that's nothing, very easily ignoring the 1,000 trigger warning texts that everyone had found and all the rest of it in an attempt to downplay it. But, you can find cases like this in the news going back the last 5 years, and they're 10 a penny, really. And also, there's the fact that they're often ridiculous never even stops them being applied. Like some of them, I think it was Nottingham Trent said that people studying French didn't have to look at Charlie Hebdo because it was racist. That was kind of par for the course. But, Aberdeen said that A Midsummer Night's Dream was classist, and they had a trigger warning to that effect. I think the same university said Chaucer could be quite emotionally challenging. And then Greenwich had a trigger warning on 1984, which is kind of funny in itself, but specifically for suicide and animal cruelty, which again is absolutely absurd. But they just don't see the problem with it. They don't see that it's absurd. And as with the other Times investigation we saw this week about UCU members effectively kind of trying
that's the University Lecturers Union.
Exactly, in Britain, effectively trying to cook up ways to kind of out and oust gender critical people in their HR departments, all this stuff. It really is endemic. I'm just amazed that there's people who are still trying to naysay this, to pretend that it's not going on. And it's just utterly unconvincing at this point. The reason that you don't think it's a problem is because you're basically in favour of it. That's essentially why so many of these academics are naysaying it now. Because how long can you ignore the evidence of your own eyes, let alone a Times investigation?
There's two things that seem particularly extraordinary at this kind of juncture. One is that the government has made so many pointed interventions in this, and it's still going on.
And legal interventions.
And legal interventions. The Higher Education Free Speech Bill. There's also the fact that a lot of the things going on are being instigated, it seems, by the Lecturers Union, or by, you know, the people who are in charge of the syllabus and things like that. This is not necessarily the blue fringe, non-binary student, the snowflake 18-year-old that we've got so used to ridiculing. This is just part of the structure now.
You expect students to be a bit crazy in a kind of woke direction. But as you say, this is the institutions. And I mean, it reminds me of a long time ago, maybe 8-9 years ago now, the great Brendan O'Neill of Spiked, and I went to some Cambridge debate. It wasn't the union, it was some college, King's College politics debating thing. And we got talking to some students afterwards, and we were both, on the way back, these guys were really, like, their minds were so weird.
Yeah.
And so, and then out of that came this Spectator cover, which is one of my favourite ever Spectator covers, it was called the Stepford Students.
Yeah.
And it was them with their sort of weird eyes, before the eyes were a meme, I hasten. And it was a really good cover because it was, you know, about this sort of strange phenomenon. And then, of course, I just couldn't have imagined how it never stopped. And and of course, they've graduated, they're in jobs, they're in corporations, these guys, and they don't change to fit the world.
Yeah.
The world changes to fit them. And that's what's happening in the universities now. The universities are anticipating their reactions long before they even have them. And I think for a lot of students, it's very bamboozling.
And Tom, I mean, going back to this University Colleges Union example, where essentially, you know, you have union representatives looking to root out gender critical feminists. I mean, why do you think that issue in particular has become so heated? Because it seems to be, in terms of the academics that are being hounded, in terms of and certainly in the UCU's case, you'd think they'd want to protect those people, but they'd want to go after them or are silent in the face of this kind of persecution. What is it about trans that has sort of taken over this debate?
I mean, it's the $1 million question. I think it's one of those things where you have an absurd orthodoxy that thinks biological sex doesn't exist, and that thinks that anyone who believes that, you know, someone who's 6'4" and has 5 o'clock shadow shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's swimming events or whatever is a horrendous bigot. You've had that coalesce itself in these institutions over an incredibly short period. And as a consequence of that, even people who are not particularly within a university kind of sphere, natural kind of heretics or heterodox people have found themselves caught up in it. How that happened, I have absolutely no idea. But it's a really telling example of what the climate is like on universities at the moment and why it's so messed up. Because on the one hand, you see something like the trigger warning story and you think this is depressing because it's creating this environment which is not about challenge, it's about wrapping people in cotton wool. It's turning universities effectively into not places which are about the free exchange of ideas, all these cliches that we previously told ourselves, but that is kind of a community of the like-minded and is a place in which these vulnerable people can protect themselves from a kind of awful world or whatever. But there's a flip side to that, which is viciousness meted out against anyone who refuses to get with the program. I think that viciousness is informed by the misogyny of this movement in large part. I mean, the vast majority of cases, there's loads of gender critical academics, I'm sure. In the vast majority of cases, it's women who get caught up in this. There's a special kind of vitriol reserved for them. Why that's come about, I don't know. But I think it's the one, I don't want to say it's a positive thing, but it's demonstrated what has been clear to certainly us at Spike for a very long time, which is this is a very serious issue. And if you don't take it seriously, it will spread. People who you like and agree with are going to get caught up in this. And whilst a lot of people didn't really care when it was right-wingers or even the far right who were targeted by no platform, they're seeing now that age-old lesson of censorship, which is you don't even defend that guy from those kinds of tactics. They will be meted out on you. Why that's happened with the trans issue rather than anything else, I have no idea. But
if you don't stop no platform for fascists, you'll get no platform for feminists.
That's what I think what the reason the trans issue is so hot is because it points towards the civil war within liberalism. And it's, you know, if I'm a devout Catholic and I say I disagree with trans ideology, everyone's like, well, of course you would. You're a reactionary.
Or you've got all these other horrible opinions.
But because it's mostly TERFs, it's radical feminists saying, you know, it's coming from a liberal position. That's why the hatred is so much more intense, because it's close ideologically.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Freddie, I mean, you know, America has a First Amendment. I'm sure all of us here would love some kind of similar protection in the UK, but it makes no bloody difference on campus. They're just as crazy, if not crazier.
You do get this strange, I hate to use the term gaslighting, it's overused, but it is sort of gaslighting when people go, oh, no, you can still say whatever you want.
Yeah.
You know, or no, these books aren't being banned, you can still buy them. Yeah. But it's like, well, no, but you're ousting them, or you're trying to condition people into not accepting that they should be read and things like that. So it is odd, and it is a threat to free speech, and free speech is undoubtedly under threat.
Yeah,
and anybody who pretends it isn't is mad or a bit sinister.
It does make you think, though, like, at what point are people going to start wondering why any government funding goes to universities? Or what point are people going to be thinking to themselves, why would I send my child to an institution like this? Because, if you don't have free speech and academic freedom, what do you have? I mean, it just becomes like a kind of 3-year holiday.
Yeah.
And a massive bill at the end of it. And you might get indoctrinated along the way if you're careful. I mean, how does that stick up for itself? Now, obviously, people will talk about research and the hard sciences, although it's creeping in around the edges there. There's
absolutely.
Woke, censorious ideology and all the rest of it. We had a piece this week about how people want to say bones are gender neutral or some such in certain universities. I won't go into that, but you can read about it. So it is creeping in there. But I think particularly in terms of the humanities and the arts and all the rest of it, people are going to start wondering, we've known a lot of these degrees were kind of useless, to say that heretical thing these days, as far as getting a job. That was one justification the universities had for themselves. But there's going to be a certain point in which people are thinking, why are we allowing this to, why should we support this? And that's a genuine tragedy. The universities are a really important institution, but this is where it's ended up.
The humanities are absolutely, it's the legacy of our civilization. It's absolutely worth defending. I mean, of course, there's always autoethnography and wanking that you could take part in. Maybe we should leave it there.
I don't know what you're referring to.
This is the case of the man who was doing his PhD essentially in wanking, and not just a PhD in wanking, but wanking to particularly suspect material. I'm not going to say any more than that, but it's been a big Twitter story the past 24 hours, and I'm delighted that we decided not to talk about it in too much detail because it makes me feel a little bit sick.
Well, let's move on. But I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed I've missed it. Actually, I'm quite proud of myself having missed it. I'm obviously going to look it up immediately.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.